thank you all for being here. This is a panel that's kind of near and dear to my heart because I've spent a lot of time over the years working with our incredible, gigantic, successful, amazing ports in the San Pedro Bay, the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach, which are side by side. In fact, it takes a long time to figure out which side of the cliff I'm on there, right? But they're two ports that together comprise the fifth largest port facility on Earth. They've also been world leaders in how to embrace environmental responsibility in real and tangible ways in a very rough environment. If you've been around a port, ports are big and heavy and they can be dirty. There are a lot of ports around the world that are major sources of pollutants. They burn oil and diesel and operate under some pretty alarming conditions. By contrast, the Port of Long Beach and the Port of Los Angeles are really sort of epic adventures in how to green an operating port and do it successfully. They're all also, I would say, friendly competitors in seeing who can innovate the fastest, which is a really cool kind of competition to have, right? To be more efficient, to be more environmentally responsible. But remember that implementing the ambitious Ports Clean Air Action Plan and all of the things they're doing is not easy and it's not cheap. And one of the questions that we're going to hear from our panelists today is what motivates hard-driving business people who work in a very tough environment for a port, right? We have incredibly stringent air quality standards in California. We're glad we do, but we do. We have renewable portfolio standards. You can't buy cheap coal power, right? You're buying ultimately 50% renewable power. We have relatively high-priced labor, in part because we have high-priced housing. The real estate market is tough here. Right? We have a tough operating environment. So what motivates real businessmen to invest, as you'll hear, billions of dollars in doing the right thing, in minimizing pollution, in making the ports safer and better? What motivates them? Does it pay? Do they do it out of the goodness of their heart, or is it good business? Can you really do well by doing good? And that's kind of the story of the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach. So with that, let's hear about it from these leaders who come from different perspectives. To my left is Jonathan Rosenthal, who's the managing partner of Saybrook, serial entrepreneur who's launched, I don't know how many companies, a ton, and has a deep interest in this. He was recently appointed by the U.S. Department of Transportation to the Marine Transportation System National Advisory Committee. Mayor of Los Angeles appointed Jonathan to the Los Angeles Sustainable Freight Advisory Committee. He's actively in this marketplace. And to your right, my left, beyond Jonathan, we have Rick Cameron. I've known Rick a long time. He's Managing Director of Environmental Affairs and Planning for the Port of Long Beach. So many of the great ideas that you're seeing at the Port of Long Beach came from his head. I could tell you more about Rick, but he's a pro and he's doing great work. To Rick's left is Dale Gauthier, who is a professional engineer. He's an area business unit leader for AECOM and has 35 years of experience in energy and power and has worked very actively with our ports along with many other customers on renewable projects and various green projects. And a change in panel, we're very lucky to have him. We have Mr. Benoit Lacroix, who is the co-founder, board member, and VP of Sales and Marketing for Afenco. And Benoit, did I pronounce your last name right?
You did such a good job.
Okay. Well, my mother's Canadian, so it's in my genes. It's in my genes, yes. But I don't say progress or hoos.
Or Zed.
Or Zed. And finally, last but certainly not least, packed in the corner there, is Chris Chase, who's the marketing manager for the Port of Los Angeles. So we've got a great panel, and we want to give each of them a few minutes to tell us a little bit. I like to say we're closing today with a good news panel. Tremendous accomplishments by these ports and the vendors who support them to making our ports something we can be proud of. So in no particular order, Jonathan, you want to kick us off? Say a few words here?
Yeah, I'll try
Try to keep it short, although my wife tells me that's impossible. So I came to this freight ecosystem sort of through the back door. I run a private equity firm, have for many, many years, and I've spent the past 30 plus years investing in disrupted systems. So I spent 10 years around the airline business. I spent a similar amount of time around utilities. So I try to find, as an investor, industries going through disruption and where there's a lot of innovation occurring and where the participants in that industry are relatively slow adopters. They're not necessarily slow adopters because they're lazy or they're not smart or they don't work hard. They tend to be slow adopters because they have so much embedded infrastructure. So very, very tough to make a change. For example, an airline, great example. How do you take an airline that had been regulated for 75 years, all of a sudden you take off the regulation and you say good luck? The implications there are enormous. So about 6-7 years ago, we started investing heavily in the freight ecosystem. We bought warehousing operators, we bought trucking companies, data analytics companies, and it became pretty apparent quickly that there was enormous opportunity, that industry was being disrupted rapidly. Consumer buying habits, technology, environmental issues, deregulation. And I was very, very fortunate to find two fantastic partners. One principally the Port of Los Angeles, and in particular the executive director, Gene Soroka, who's came out of the private sector, but is really a big thinker, willing to take risk, willing to sort of kick ass and take names. He's just a fantastic partner, and the rest of the LA Port staff. And the Port of Long Beach. The Port of Long Beach has been nothing but supportive with us, and so we are building today. We are probably 4 weeks away from getting from us committing about $150 million in what is one of the only public-private ventures, I think, in the city of Los Angeles, to a large asset and a change in the way the distribution system works, and so. That's what we're spending our time doing, with Rick's help and everybody else's.
Awesome. Rick, tell us more from the standpoint of a guy who has to worry about all this every day at the Port of Long Beach.
Well, I've been at the port a little over 20 years, and when I first started, both ports were in double-digit growth. Everything was being driven by how fast we could get the capacity that was necessary for us to handle the containers. And if you haven't read the two ports, both, and when you combine the two ports together, we've had our best record year, surpassing, was it 07?
Yes.
Yeah, 07 numbers. And I'm glad I've got the business side. Usually Chris Cannon and I are up here talking about why we need to do this, but it's important because it was very evident in what we just accomplished in terms of updating our Clean Air Action Plan, that we were in a different environment. And 15 years ago, the two ports, going back to the double-digit growth and the need for infrastructure and where we needed to have the facilities in place to handle this cargo through this gateway, we weren't getting EIRs through. So as much as I'd like to take credit for a lot of great ideas, we weren't listening at the time. And well, I'll speak for Long Beach. Long Beach wasn't listening at the time. I think both ports really, we had to change our culture, and I think we did that. And it wasn't easy, and it definitely wasn't inexpensive doing that, but we reprioritized in terms of where we needed to address the community concerns, working with the regulatory agencies, lining up our plans and our operations in terms of emission reduction, not only within the region for attainment, but also at the state level. That I think we attempted to do it in a very siloed, piecemeal fashion, focusing on the low-hanging fruit, cargo handling equipment, and there was a lot of resistance to dealing with things like trucks. So I think the first iteration of the Clean Air Action Plan was very important for both ports for us to be where we are today with our business, but also implementing the projects that were put on hold for several years. We're in a different world now. We just updated our plan. It was interesting that a lot of the stakeholders changed. We're in a different environment. Our industry is transitioning, transforming. Last year, the Port of Long Beach had to get through a bankruptcy. So in the same year, you start talking about having to invest $7 to $14 billion, depending on which pathway you go for clean air. And you just came off the heels of one of your larger marine container terminals, shipping lines going into bankruptcy. It's pretty hard for decision makers to want to actually think about swallowing something and how we're going to pay for it, and really what's the true effect of this gateway when it comes to discretionary cargo, which is something that's very important. So we heard a lot of that as we went through the development of the Clean Air Action Plan. And I think the respective boards, and between Gene and Mario, and Mario Cordero is my boss. He started in June. He came out of DC. I think he has a really good perspective on the industry as a whole with his tenure in DC, specifically as chair. So I think he's bringing a lot of that to the table as we start to embark upon the road. I mean, we already have our plan. Now we've got to get into some details. The first things that we're going to be doing, and I'll kind of hand it off here, is really thinking about the feasibility. We have goals that have been set by our respective mayors: 2030 for all cargo handling equipment in the port to be zero emission, and then 2035 for trucks. So one of the first things that we wanted to do was not debate feasibility when we were developing the plan, but have the time to do a really good feasibility analysis and also have check-ins with this technology and push the envelope. And that really is the goals and the direction that our respective mayors and our boards have adopted. So we're going to be starting this feasibility analysis. We're going to be looking at the framework, for instance, of prioritizing certain strategies, specifically with trucks. So we'd be more than happy to entertain any questions related to that. I think both ports, lastly, because this event here is pretty broad-based. It's not just air. I mean, there's energy, there's resiliency. As we start to move forward with a zero-emission platform, first of all, we're fuel neutral and technology neutral. So it's whatever's going to get us in the most cost-effective way, get us the reductions when we need them. We need to also have the backbone, and that's energy. So as we start to think about maybe being more dependent upon the grid, we need to think about working with our respective utilities. Edison is our utility, DWP on the LA side, and really figuring out, as it's not just the mobile sources on the technology side, it's what's going to be the infrastructure necessary to support this, and also having the resiliency. Today, if the grid goes down, you can still take a diesel truck over and fuel up a cargo handling equipment. In the future, if they're dependent upon the grid and fast chargers, what if the grid goes down? So I think it's a big question for the two ports and our utility to really think about what we need to work on together to support that platform. So.
All right, Dale.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Jim. So AECOM's been working with both the Port of Long Beach and the Port of Los Angeles for a number of years now. And as Rick alluded to, I think much of the earlier work that we did was really focused on more throughput, which sort of is a bit, flies in the face of, I think, some of the more current goals, which are more focused on sustainability and resiliency. So, but we've also supported many of those type efforts as well. Rick mentioned a couple of different times the Clean Air Action Plan. You know, that you've got to have a plan. You've got to know where your emission sources are to be able to affect the outcome. So not only does it quantify and identify your emission sources, but it also gives you strategies to further reduce those as you build out your infrastructure. The second large project that was, I think, had multi benefits was the Alameda Corridor, which was an additional method of more efficiently handling cargo out of the port, and almost as a side benefit, a much lower emission profile, much more sustainable method of handling cargo at the port. And then last but certainly not least, which is the shore-to-ship repowering or powering program. Very complicated. You know, you think you just bring a ship in and plug it in, but the reality is it affects all of your infrastructure. You know, when a ship comes in and you've got all of a sudden, it was self-sustaining before by running its emergency duty generator sets, and all of a sudden you're taking on a 5 to 7 megawatt load. at each of the berths, that makes a big impact on your infrastructure, all the way up through and including the supply point from LADWP or SoCal Edison. So ports, in terms of themselves being a very intense energy user, they're different from other industrial and large commercial applications. They use a lot of energy. They have a very high energy density. They don't have a lot of space, so that limits some of your options for alternate power supply, on-site renewable generation. Jonathan was talking earlier. We worked with Jonathan. We looked at some pretty creative ways to try to bring renewable power to the ports. They're not necessarily well suited for wind, given their location, but solar can be an option, but there's complications with that. Ports have unique equipment. They're not like your typical commercial or industrial client where there's lots of potential suppliers into the space, all competing for the business, all driving additional value, more efficiency. A port is a subset of a larger industrial commercial setting. So you don't have all the efficiency improvements that you do in other industries. So they are different, and so they have to be treated differently, and their path forward will look a lot different than the average consumer, large industrial consumer that's trying to reduce their carbon footprint. It's a totally different animal, and it's a profile in and on itself. So,
Cool. Thank you. Now, Benoit, you're an innovator who's trying to do something that will make all of this easier. So tell us about that. Yes.
You need to let me do my peddler job a little bit. There you go. All right. No. Neither. These Canadians. So thank you. Yeah. So at Effenco, we've been playing with trucks for the last decade. I like to say a bit more than a decade now, and we've been working too sometimes, really working on greening and electrifying trucks based on a pragmatic approach, a progressive approach. And why I say pragmatic is really data drives all our decision in the design of our technology. We like to say that without data, you're just another one with an opinion. It's pretty annoying when you try to argue on your idea at the office, but it works. So we try not to base anything on feelings, but really on data. We have an extensive database on several types of trucks on each side of that continent and on the other side on the Atlantic, on all kind of vocational trucks. That's our space. This is where we focus. And what we found out over time is all of these trucks that you used to see, vocational trucks, so buses, refuse trucks, cement mixers, port tractors, shunter trucks, they are immobile for a large proportion of their operating times. And they have this massive combustion engine. Let's stay fuel agnostic. Huge engine, sometimes just turning idle, sometimes producing a little bit of power for equipment, but it's a very inefficient use of energy. And that's for us, it's the first low-hanging, juicy fruit of saving. It's energy efficiency, basically, and this is what we focus on. So in a nutshell, we deliver a hybrid stop-start technology, basically eliminating the use of combustion engine when these vehicles are immobile. So we like to call ourselves, or to say that we're 100% electric 50% of the time. In a nutshell, it's a few components. It's ultra-capacitor-based technology, hybrid starters. We electrify all the accessories, and at the end of the day, we turn off the engine about half of the day, saving 30% fuel and related emission. And of course, it's silent operation at stop. And I guess my personal role throughout all this time was to connect really the technology, the numbers, to really the users. And we've been through all kinds of technology milestones, union adoption, fleet adoption now, all kind of lab testing. and a lot of data on the field. We still ride along with the drivers and with the users themselves, trying to understand still. The devil is in the details, heating, air conditioning, all the little details that makes really a technology that at the end is being adopted, and we still put a lot of energy in that. And I guess what's relevant to here, we work with 3 ports now, Port of Montreal, of course, with 2 operators, Port of Vancouver with Global and DP World, and also with the Port of New York with terminal, APM terminal and Global terminal. And I guess I'll be happy to answer questions a bit later. Thank you.
Thank you.
And sorry about my voice. It's almost dying. There you go, sir.
Mine too. This is my 5th panel, and the only thing that will help is a glass of good Cabernet. Doctor's orders. So, last but definitely not least, Chris.
Well, thank you very much. So I'm coming at this from a little bit of a different perspective than some of the stuff we've been talking about here. Traditionally, the ports, and we're still doing it, we've been doing it for 110 years and we're not changing that, is building brick and mortar. I mean, we build real things. We physically have to move items from point A to point B. That is our only reason for existence. But the idea is here, and we've been talking about it, but we're doing something a little differently on our end. We're still building. We've got, like Long Beach, we've got, what, billions out there to be built over the next decade. So there's plenty of brick and mortar to be done. But how can we do it a little bit better? How can we do it a little more efficiently? And we've been presented with a number of different options to us based on the way the industry changes. We've seen a lot of consolidation. Rick mentioned one of their customers, and my customer too, and the LA side going bankrupt last year. That took out one competitor. We've had 5 or 6 mergers that are either taking place in the last 18 months or will be over the course of the next year. A lot of changes going on, a lot of ways you manage equipment, a lot of ways you own things. A lot of things are changing. And with that, it's making things more complicated. And that complications are not making things better. And more importantly, they're not making things more efficient. And on top of that, they're not making things, delivering goods to you at the end of the day in the most efficient way you could. And more importantly, there's waste in there. And through various different means, both LA and Long Beach had opportunity to handle some very, very large container ships. We have big ones today. We had a couple demos of a couple larger ones. And we did a couple things on that when that ship came in about 2 years ago that kind of kicked off the project that I'm working on as part of the business development group. And the idea was that, if we know stuff a little bit better, if we have a little more information, can we make better decisions? Can we have equipment in the right place at the right time and not doing things twice or 3 times or not having to rehandle things we don't need to? And that's really what we're going after. So after my boss has mentioned, Gene Soroka, our executive director, he was kind of percolating this idea. He went, was on a number of committees out of Washington, D.C., different federal groups, and it all came down to one thing that he kind of heard and they kind of agreed upon. Better visibility is necessary. And so with that, about 15 months ago, we partnered with GE Transportation, their digital section, not the folks who build, trains and engines that fly jets, but the technology side, to look at what we could do here. And we ran a pilot last summer that kind of got the idea of how do we connect 6 or 7 different pieces of the supply chain that all have technology, but they don't talk to each other. And the basic idea was, effectively, we'll use Shanghai since it's our biggest source of cargo coming into, Southern California. It's 14 days over in the ocean. And it sits on a ship and doesn't do anything else than sit on a ship for 14 days, but no one does anything with that information until the last minute. So our idea kind of behind this is we're working on a technology project to say this visibility and to share that visibility amongst the 7 or 8 different partners that interact with a given shipment here in the ports in Southern California. And so this is what we're doing. So we're doing this to create a computer system, a system of systems. We're not replacing anything, we're just gonna make things talk to each other. And more importantly, having the right information in the right people's hands at the right time. And we think there's efficiencies to be gained out of that. And efficiency is both in getting your cargo where it needs to be at the right time, and of course not making mistakes or not making 3 or 4 runs, having 3 or 4 extra trucks coming when we don't need them. We don't need that. That's gonna help. So this is all this kind of different angle away from the brick and mortar, more to the digital range. Most of us order online, think Amazon, the rest of them. Obviously Amazon's huge customers of ours. Hundreds of thousands of containers every year are handling to Amazon. You click on it, you can see every single second of that shipment coming to your house. We don't do that for the rest of the supply chain. They don't see it till it gets to their warehouse. They can see it, but it's not that easy. And we're talking about here where you have people dispatching, having a dozen, 15, 18 websites open at the same time, trying to track their cargo. We're trying to get it onto one screen. So that's kind of this new idea that we're going after. And this is our idea. And we're funding this to take a little bit of Jonathan's thunder there. We are venture capitalists at the moment. The Port of LA decided to be a venture capitalist. We're putting our money where our mouth is on this, and we're seeing if we can make it work. The biggest thing we heard from the pilot we did was, it will work, but it's got to be everybody. If it's not everybody, it's not going to happen. So right now we're working on getting the rest of the port of, all the partners in the port on board, all the different shipping companies, all the different facilities on board right now. And we're looking to get this done by midsummer. Have something out there that's commercially viable, out there that can replace 15 or 16 websites. Not replacing the companies that do them, we're just taking those feeds and putting them into one. So it's kind of a unique project. It's called the Port Optimizer, and we're trying to prove it out here in LA, and we have every intention of giving it to GE to run with it for the rest of the world. So it's a kind of a unique process we're working on.
Can I get it on my phone?
You will be.
Okay, cool.
More importantly, yes.
If it's not on my phone, it just doesn't
Right,
count,
exactly.
right? In fact, this is not happening until I tweet about it.
Right, exactly.
Well, see, there's a different angle that's interesting, where what Chris just talked about was an efficiency improvement that lowers costs, improves performance, that as a corollary can reduce emissions, for example, because you don't waste truck trips, right? In the utility industry, we call it windshield time, that our linemen had an amazing ability to spend the whole day in the truck without actually doing work, and they were moving the whole time. But they'd go to the site and they'd go, oh, that's a Howard transformer. We got to go back to the yard and get the parts for a Howard transformer. And they'd go back to the yard, and then they'd come back to the site, and these were an hour apart, right? And they'd say, oh man, that's an old Howard B. That's different parts. And they'd go back to the yard, right? And so you think about telemetry, where they know what kind it is before they leave and the parts are already on the truck, and you dispatch the crew that's closest to the job, not furthest away, right? Simple and really effective in reducing emissions because you reduce truck miles, right? So that's a different spin on it. Well, now with the exception a little bit of Chris, you four do not yet get a passing grade because you didn't actually address sort of one of our principal questions here that I want to hear about, right? Now, Rick said, well, there's a plan, and there's state requirements we have to comply with, and we have to spend money. Well, I get that. But the fact is that the Port of Long Beach and the Port of Los Angeles are spending a ton of money that is not required to comply with the state standard. It's to comply with a plan that you have developed internally to be more environmentally responsible, right? To advance that ball at the ports. Why do you want to do that? You're competing against ports where they don't care. They burn oil, they burn coal, they use cheap labor. Why do you want to do that? What's the motivation? Port guys, you two port guys, pony up.
I'm glad because you kind of have the business side, the commercial side here, and Chris did a really good job of that. I didn't mention efficiency. Efficiency is a huge piece of the Cleaner Action Plan, and much different than what we had in the original two caps. Jim, I don't know if, there's a lot of people who would disagree with you whether this plan is doing enough, frankly. I think the two ports found a balance. We have, for years now, pushed the envelope in terms of demonstrations and pilots. We've been successful in this last year, both ports have, of receiving state grant money, whether it's CEC, CARB, working with AQMD, deploying not just R&D, but actually deploying units in more of a fleet environment, not onesie twosies as we've done in the past. So I think as we're laying out kind of the strategies and the framework of those strategies, the plan's done. Now it's what are we going to be implementing? What does that look like? And what's the time frame in which we can do that? I think we have to strike that balance when it comes to what we push, working with partners, getting as much funding as we can out of Sacramento. I don't think we're going to get much help out of DC, frankly, but at least Sacramento. And then how do we balance that with our business? And that's going to be important. That's why the key is these feasibility studies. We didn't have the time. A lot of people were asking us questions, and we didn't have the time because we needed to get the plan kind of wrapped up. And so that's why this year is going to be critical for us to really understand how we're going to be meeting these goals we set out. And so on a parallel track, pushing the development of these pilots on the terminals, or looking for different concepts like my friend here is working with the Port of Los Angeles on, that's great. I think even though we haven't officially launched a portal like LA has, we've been in discussions about looking at Bay-wide strategies, whether it's kind of working either with GE or something else. It's a discussion we're having with our board right now about how we move that forward as well, because the customers at LA are the same customers in Long Beach, frankly. And so they want to know certainty. They want to have one platform. They don't want two separate platforms at both ports. One last thing I'll say, and this is critical, not only having that information sharing is important, there's another component we've committed to, which is a reservation system on the truck side of things. Turn times at the gates has been very controversial for many years now. And so as we're pushing the trucking industry to go into a near zero or zero emission platform, they want the assurance, just like anybody else, that they're going to get their money's worth out of it. And meaning they don't want a clean truck sitting at the gate for 2 hours. So we need to also line up having efficiencies at the gate and ensuring that they're going to be able to get the use out of that investment they've made. So those are the things that we're focusing on. That's where the innovation with the operations and everything else needs to kind of line up with our Cleaner Action Plan and moving forward with some of these new technologies.
So folks, we've got very few minutes between this and your cocktail, but I want to open it up so that anybody has any questions for our panelists can throw them out. If you don't, I'll keep going, but please.
Chris, question for you regarding the GE transportation system and the 15, 16 other systems that have their own detail. Is part of the next generation of the application to really open up through APIs or others to have other vendors come in to really build that capacity for drilling down all the way to the level of data like Benoit is talking about?
Yes, I mean, all those are part of the eventual. Like I said, we don't have a product out there on the street yet, so it's, but yes, it's every intention of, to do these various different permutations, but yes, APIs and development, and we call them bolt-ons. One of them is an appointment system, as we talk about, critical to what we're doing, but again, it's kind of an open door at the moment, and GE's been partnering with a number of different existing vendors here in the Harbor Complex to do exactly that, to get the most efficient use out of this, to get adoption, because there's opportunities here to go bigger. And you know, one of the things that makes it very enticing is if you can think about, much like you do with an Amazon, you don't care that it comes out of a warehouse in Pennsylvania or one here in Southern California, as long as you get your stuff. Same thing kind of holds true for the folks who provide. If I can sit at my desktop anywhere in the country and see every single one of my shipments, every single port off of one screen, all of a sudden that becomes a much more efficient way to do business. And there's some opportunities there across the board for many different parts of the supply chain and all the different things we've been talking about up here. I mean, there's all interrelated.
Please.
So in the transition to zero-emission vehicles for the ports, most of it's all grant funded right now. So when we start thinking about getting to 100%, at some point in time, we're going to transition to where the tenant operators are actually going to start purchasing those vehicles themselves. It's not going to be from grant funds. And if you look at that projection of 2030, 2035, when do you think that is? Is it the next 5 years or?
So there's, I'll have to answer it. So on the cargo handling equipment side of it, in terms of the 2030, the strategy we laid out in the CAP was we'll work with our individual MTOs and marine terminal operators to figure out what their procurement plans are and start there, because there was a lot of question marks about when, and it's not available, how can I plan for it, because that's, I mean, we're dealing with private industry here. And so we've committed to work with them individually, and they all have their different plans. It's not a one-size-fits-all. So that's how we're going to handle kind of the within the fence line of working with them. That's why we're doing the feasibility analysis, and we want to be, you know, have a better sense. And we kind of communicated this to our board. It's a goal. It's not a mandate. 2030 is a goal. And so if for some reason the technology is not commercially available and is not feasible in terms of cost effectiveness, and that's kind of laying out that criteria before we do the analysis, then we'll have to figure out where that bar goes next. I mean, we've got to stay competitive, and that was a big theme. And so that's how we would handle it on the marine terminal side. Would you agree with that, Chris?
Yeah, no, exactly,
okay.
and
Right.
that's the big one you hit there is commercially available.
Yeah,
It doesn't,
it's-
you know, because there's a lot of great ideas out there, but we've had a number of people come to us, you know, over the years in the last decade with electric trucks, and the fact is that, as we know out there, it's a little different than a car, and how you move 40,000 pounds of cargo around versus 4 people, probably a couple hundred pounds each. It's a different type of environment. And I think those are the kind of things that sometimes get lost. The fact is, this is a big industry. We're moving big things, and it doesn't work quite the same way. Much like plugging in a ship and needing, you know, many megawatts worth of power versus it's not an extension cord. You know, that kind of mentality.
Plus so from the Long Beach side, when it comes to, you know, working with our MTOs, our large container terminals, we've got some of the bigger leases are going to be coming up here in the next, I don't know, 8 to 10 years, depending on which terminal we're referring to. Outside of Middle Harbor, which already has its 40-year, 35-year lease, I guess now, what's remaining on the 40-year. You know, that's how we'll look at how we can work with our customers to make this as cost-effective and feasible. There's other instruments the ports have working with our customers. The trucking side is going to be tricky, and we're going to be developing and looking at what we call a rate in terms of, you know, what that'll look like. Where's the fine line that we're adding another, you know, rate on top of Pier Pass, on top of other things that make this gateway a little bit more expensive than other gateways. And so that goes back into what does that look like, and where's the tipping point if we push it too hard from losing our discretionary cargo. And so that's all been laid out for the next 12 to 18 months, and that'll then link up with the structure of the next Clean Trucks program. I think one thing that's important too is having and this is something we're already kicking around, early action. There is money for trucks on early action, but it's not going to pay for everything. One of the things that could help is having a secondary market for the clean trucks. The trucks that are in the port right now are very clean if you look at the profile of the trucks. They may not meet the standards of where we want to go or even where the state wants to go in the long run, but they'd be much cleaner in a different gateway, I can guarantee you that. And just because you know, California is so progressive in its legislation and the regulations and things like that, other states don't have that. In fact, I bet they could take our 2010s and their communities would love it. And so how do we establish that without having it look like we're punting our dirty trucks somewhere else? They're not dirty, they meet the standards. The bar is increased here in California, and we have our own goals. So if we can establish a secondary market, then the numbers start to pencil out a little bit in terms of cost effectiveness. So those are the things we're pushing. I think AQMD is actually looking into that. So if we can get, you know, our partners with the regulatory community in the same alignment with us on this, and they can help influence that, I mean, those are the things that we're looking at. So.
You know, just a final comment, because we're really about out of time.
You really want your wine, don't you?
And, no, but I don't want David Abel to start yelling at me because you miss your reception somewhere. You know, if you look across this table, right, you think about the composition. Successful global investor, port leader, engineer and constructor, innovator trying to change the paradigm, bring tools, port leader. This is the kind of partnership that makes our ports something we can be proud of that most ports don't have. It's unique to California, to Southern California, to our ports. We're proud to have all these guys involved. Would you join me in thanking them?